Let's talk about Easter. If you spend any time online, you've probably seen posts, memes, and articles claiming Easter is just a remix of a bunch of ancient springtime cults. Painted eggs, chocolate bunnies, sunrise services, they'll tell you it's all really about pagan gods, not Jesus. But before we toss out Resurrection Sunday along with the jelly beans, let's slow down and look at the facts. Because here's the thing, the origins of Easter aren't tucked away in some shadowy pagan past. They're front and center, right in the heart of the Bible. If you open the Gospels, you'll see the story doesn't start with bunnies, baskets, or even the word Easter. It begins with Passover, a Jewish festival commemorating freedom and deliverance. And it just so happens that's exactly when Jesus was crucified. The Last Supper, Passover meal. Jesus on the cross, during Passover. And just as the original Passover pointed to rescue from death, the resurrection of Jesus shouts humanity's deliverance, life-breaking through death, for good. Now, after Jesus' resurrection, his followers started gathering on Sundays, not just out of habit, but to mark the day everything changed. They even called it the Lord's Day. Not Saturday, not Tuesday, but Sunday, because that's when Jesus rose. These first Christians didn't celebrate a vague spring festival. They remembered a real, earth-shaking event. The resurrection they'd actually witnessed. They called the holiday Pascha, which is a word straight from the Jewish Passover. And, fun fact, that's still what it's called in places like Greece, Italy, France, pretty much everywhere except for places that are primarily English or German. So if you've been told Easter was invented by pagans or was stolen from some ancient fertility cult, the evidence just doesn't add up. The celebration sprang out of the resurrected Jesus, seen, touched, eaten with, right there in history, not in myth. Are the springtime vibes a total coincidence? Well, not really. The timing lines up with Passover for a reason, because that's when it happened. The point was always the resurrection, not rabbits. Now, before we dig further into Easter, let's address a classic timeline question. People sometimes ask if Jesus said he'd be in the grave for 3 days and 3 nights, well, how does that match up with dying on Friday and rising on Sunday? Isn't that at best only a couple days? Well, that's a good question. Here's what's going on. When Jesus spoke of 3 days and 3 nights, he was using the common way people in his time counted days. In first century Jewish reckoning, any part of a day counts as a whole day and night. So even if it's just a bit of one day, it's still considered part of the count. Let's break down how this plays out in the Bible. In Esther 4:16, Esther tells the Jews to fast, neither eat nor drink for 3 days, night or day. But in the very next chapter, Esther 5:1, we see that on the 3rd day she goes to the king. So the period called 3 days and 3 nights only lasted into the 3rd day. Well, that's less than 3 full 24-hour cycles. Now let's look at the gospel evidence. The Gospels are pretty clear that Jesus died and was buried on what they call the Day of Preparation. That is, the day before the Sabbath. Sabbath is Saturday, which means the day of preparation would be Friday. You can find that in Mark 15:42, Luke 23:54, and John 19:31. Then Jesus' body remained in the tomb through the entire Sabbath, which we know as Saturday. Now, all 4 Gospels say Jesus rose early on the first day of the week. That's Matthew 28:1, Mark 16:2, Luke 24:1, and John 21. That's Sunday morning. So if you count it out, Friday, the day he died and was buried, well, that's day 1. Saturday, all day in the tomb, well, that's day 2. And Sunday, he rose at dawn, well, that's day 3. By the way people spoke back then, that fully satisfies 3 days and 3 nights. Any part of a day counted toward the total. It doesn't require a literal 72-hour count. It lines up with how other events are timed in the Bible, and it's exactly what the people who wrote the scripture would have understood. So it's not a mistake or a cover-up, it's just how people talked about time in that culture. The gospel writers weren't confused or tricking anyone. They were using ordinary language of the day. What matters most is this: Jesus died, was buried, and just like he promised, rose on the third day. The tomb wasn't confused. It was empty. Now, back to the bigger picture. Is Easter really a pagan holiday, or is it the world-changing celebration Christians claim it is? Well, let's dig in. So where does this whole Easter is basically a pagan festival idea even come from? Most of the time it goes something like this. People point to ancient goddesses, Ishtar from Babylon or Yostra from Anglo-Saxon lore, and they say, aha! See, the names sound similar, so Easter is named after a goddess of spring or fertility. Christians just borrowed someone else's holiday and rebranded it. The problem is that kind of sounds convincing, right? But when you actually check the history and, look up some real sources, the whole argument starts to unravel pretty quickly. First, let's talk about the name. It's true that in English we call it Easter, but here's the thing, pretty much every other language calls it something like Pascha or Pasqua. That's from the Hebrew word for Passover. That's a direct link back to Israel's story, not some goddess. The English Easter comes from Old English and possibly a spring month named after a Germanic word that meant dawn or springtime. There is one ancient reference to a figure named Yostra, but the only person who ever mentions her is a monk writing in the 8th century, and even he's not too clear on the details. We have no temples, no carved statues, not even a list of her favorite foods. We have one line in one old book. And as for Ishtar, well, the similarity is only in the way the words sound, not their meaning, history, or culture. It's like saying Starbucks and Star Wars must be related because they both start with star. It's fun for wordplay, but not real scholarship. Meanwhile, the early Christians weren't big fans of blending in with pagan cultures. If anything, they got themselves in trouble for repeatedly refusing to take part in pagan celebrations. They built their identity on the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, often at great personal risk. And the timing? Well, Jesus was crucified during Passover, so naturally, that's when the church marked his resurrection. The spring celebration part is because Passover, and thus the resurrection, always happens in the spring. There was no need to borrow a festival. It was already on the calendar, thanks to God's timing. So the claim that Easter was stolen from pagan spring parties doesn't hold up to any serious digging. The church was remembering the resurrection, not worshiping spring or some ancient goddess. There's no conspiracy, just the power of an empty tomb and the beginning of a living hope. Are you ready to handle eggs, bunnies, and other so-called pagan leftovers? Let's go ahead and bust those myths next. You've probably heard the story. Eggs and rabbits are ancient symbols of fertility, so clearly when you're hiding plastic eggs in the backyard or eating bunny-shaped chocolate, you're somehow participating in some old pagan ritual, right? Well, not so fast. Yes, it's true that eggs have been symbols of new life long before they showed up in Easter baskets. But here's the thing, they're eggs. Every culture, every era, eggs are everywhere. Want to celebrate new life? An egg works. Want breakfast? An egg works. They're just common. But in Christian tradition, eggs got a fresh twist. Early Christians used to give up eating eggs for Lent, which is the season before Easter. But the chickens, well, they didn't get the memo and they just kept doing their thing. So what do you do with a bunch of eggs that you can't eat but you want to keep? Well, you boiled them. By the time Easter rolled around, you had a whole stockpile of eggs that had to go somewhere. People would share them and, yes, decorate them to make them festive. Why decorate? Well, because Easter is a celebration. In some places, people dyed their eggs red to remember Christ's sacrifice, his blood, and the promise of new life breaking out on Easter morning. And centuries later, things got even more colorful. In the 13th century, King Edward I of England had 450 eggs decorated in bright colors and gold leaf to hand out to friends and family at Easter. That's probably the fanciest Easter egg hunt in history. Now, about the Easter Bunny. Plot twist, the very first mention of an Easter bunny wasn't even a bunny at all. It was actually an Easter hare. This comes from German folklore in about the 16th century, and the idea was that the hare would lay colored eggs for good children. Not only does this show up well over 1,000 years after the resurrection of Jesus, but a hare isn't even a rabbit. They're different animals. If this was really about a fertility goddess, you'd think the symbolism would be a little bit more obvious and it wouldn't need changed, right? So yes, rabbits and hares are famous for their springtime antics and their speedy multiplication, but there's zero real evidence that the church was secretly slipping in goddess worship here. The Easter hare was just a quirky bit of folklore that hopped its way into Easter celebrations much later, especially in Germany and eventually in America. Here's the bottom line. Sometimes Christians borrowed everyday symbols and filled them with new meaning. That's not sneaky or pagan, it's just smart communication. The Bible itself is packed with real-world images. Seeds, sheep, bread, wine, even fish. Just because something shows up in more than one culture doesn't mean it's some kind of conspiracy. It just means everyone noticed the same basic things, like new life coming out of an egg or hares and rabbits popping up when winter ends. So do you have to dye eggs or eat chocolate bunnies to celebrate Jesus? No. Are you accidentally worshiping some ancient goddess if you do? Also no. Easter isn't about the extra stuff. It's about the empty tomb. If painting eggs or hiding candy helps your family talk about hope and resurrection, go for it. Just keep your focus on what really matters. What about the next claim, though? Did Emperor Constantine actually invent Easter, or is that another myth? Well, let's dig in. You might have come across the claim online that Constantine, the Roman emperor, invented Easter, or that the celebration was forced on Christians as some kind of political move. Sounds dramatic, doesn't it? But here's what actually happened. By the time Constantine was even born, Christians all over the world were already remembering and celebrating the resurrection of Jesus. In fact, we've got records of these celebrations going on at least 2 centuries before Constantine ever came to power. People like Polycarp and Melito of Sardis were already writing about Pascha, the celebration of Jesus' resurrection, way back in the 100s AD. Early Christian communities had different habits for when they marked it, and there was even a catchy name for one debate, the Quartodeciman controversy, which is kind of a mouthful, but they all agreed on one thing: Jesus rose, and it's worth celebrating. So what did Constantine actually do? Well, in 325 AD, he called together church leaders from all over the Roman Empire for something called the Council of Nicaea. One issue on the table was this: can we just pick one date for everyone to celebrate Easter? And the answer was yes. They chose to celebrate on the first Sunday after the first full moon following the spring equinox. It was a way to standardize things, not to make up a new holiday. So did Constantine invent Easter? Not even close. He just tried to get everyone's calendars to line up. The reason for the celebration, the resurrection of Jesus, was already the foundation. Bottom line, the resurrection of Jesus, the big event at the heart of Easter, was being honored right from the start by the people who actually saw it happen. Constantine just helped settle the when, not the why. So next time you hear the claim that Easter was a political invention, you'll know the truth. Easter was born at an empty tomb on a Sunday morning, long before Rome ever noticed. So if Easter isn't pagan and wasn't invented by an emperor, what's it really all about? Well, let's bring it back to the heart of the story. What is Easter, actually? Well, at its core, Easter is all about the resurrection of Jesus Christ. It's the moment that turned history upside down, the day death was defeated and hope broke out of the grave. This wasn't just a nice story that early Christians told each other to feel better about loss. These were real people who saw the empty tomb, talked with the resurrected Jesus, and were changed so much that they risked and sometimes gave their lives just to tell others about it. It wasn't about spring or bunnies or eggs. It was about a living Savior. They called the day Pascha, a shout out to Passover, because just as Passover was about freedom from slavery, Easter is about freedom from sin and death. And here's the thing. This wasn't a once-a-year thing. The very first believers started gathering for worship every Sunday. Why? Because it was the day of the resurrection, because everything had changed. The real foundation of Easter isn't myth or marketing. It's the truth that Jesus rose from the dead. That's the heartbeat. That's what gives the holiday its power and its hope. All the extras, the bunnies, the eggs, the new clothes, even the word Easter in English, they're all just side notes. Christians all over the world for 2,000 years have focused on the main event, the death and resurrection of Jesus and the promise it brings. Easter is the biggest good news there is. Death doesn't win. Hope isn't buried. And because Jesus is alive, there's new life for anyone who wants it. So maybe the most important question isn't, is Easter pagan? Maybe it's, is the resurrection of Jesus true? And what will you do with that truth? So the next time you see an egg, enjoy your family hunt, bite the chocolate bunny's ears off, or step into a sunrise service, remember, it's not those things that matter or are celebrated. It's the empty tomb. Easter is about resurrection. It's about hope. It's about Jesus, alive, victorious, and offering new life for you and for me. Happy Easter.